shall we start now? Okay, it's a great pleasure for me to introduce you to my friend and colleague, Professor Claire Griffiths, in this seminar series on sustainability. This is part of the conversations that we are having about different aspects of sustainability, and I think that it's very appropriate that this time we are going to introduce a more social dimension of sustainability. Actually, Claire will be discussing what are the relationships between gender and sustainable development. She will be sharing with us a lot of research that she has done for more than 10 years about the development in francophone countries in Africa. And she will be posing some questions on why the policies on development and gender in West Africa have not achieved the expected results. And on the contrary, there seems to be that the conditions have worsened. So as I said before, her work comprises more than 10 years of independent research in francophone Africa, in countries like Gabon, Senegal, Niger, Mali, etc. And as she has remarked in her book, the fact that she is an independent researcher makes her a complete other, a woman, foreigner, but also she's not linked or she has not been with any development agency, international aid, any of those organizations. So that gives her a very privileged approach to what it is happening in the reality of those countries. And especially in francophone African countries where there is a lot of oral tradition and a lot of things that are happening, not in documents, but in the communal life. Professor Griffiths' academic life includes a major degree in French, a master in political science, and her PhD was precisely about the issues on gender and development that were published in her book, Globalizing Postcolony. Before her current chair at the University of Chester, Claire has been a senior research fellow. Now she's an honorary research fellow at the Wilberforce Institute for the Study of Slavery and Emancipation in Gaul. And during all these years, she has been aimed at contesting the assumptions and mainstream definitions of international agencies and Western governments in the post-colonial discourses and their subtle ways of intervention in Africa. And her point, as she will be developing today, is that the current approaches to development are unsustainable, since they are not really considering the complexity of lives in those countries, where culture, traditions, and other less quantifiable aspects are determinant in their life. These are aspects that are normally ignored by the discourses on development, and including also sustainable development. So that will be very interesting for us to know a bit more about it. And currently her research concerns also the way that art can be used to understand all these complexities and less evident or documented ways in that development expresses in those countries. So thank you very much. Thank you, Claire, for coming.
Thank you very much, Beatrice. And if I may start with a few thanks also, firstly to my friend and colleague Beatrice for inviting me to come and address you within the context of the Global Sustainability Institute. This is a great privilege, and I'm very happy to come, and I think be among your first speakers anyway for the Institute. I'd also like to thank you for this opportunity to address a very interdisciplinary audience. I understand that you've come from various disciplines, that you're not necessarily in development studies or in political sociology, and I will be very interested to hear your views on any wisdom that you can bring from your disciplines into this one. Because I think I hope to convince you by the end of my talk today that we still have a lot of work to do on sustainability in gender and development in sub-Saharan Africa, without giving too much away in the early stages. So without further ado, I'll just mention that I will be speaking about 10 years of research that I've done. So if any of that is of any interest, it it's published in Globalizing the Post-Colony, which was available in Kindle in 2011, last year. I'm also going to mention a book that I've recently reviewed, which I think is tremendous, by Vin Kim Nguyen, called The Republic of Therapy. And this is one of the rare interdisciplinary studies of sustainable stroke unsustainable development in francophone Africa that has recently been published. So without further ado, I'll introduce you to the research site. Is anybody here actually familiar with French-speaking Africa? Has anybody worked there in the past? Well, just briefly, French-speaking Africa, as you can see, is a pretty substantial region of sub-Saharan Africa. It is the result of 400 years of colonial activity by the French, who started over here in Senegal in the early 1600s, settling the Senegal River and moving gradually over the course of 400 years inland, with the result that by 1910, France had colonized an area 14 times its own size, and divided this massive area, it's about 3 million square miles of sub-Saharan Africa, into two colonial regions. There was Afrique Occidentale Française, which was French West Africa, which is the yellow part, and the green part was French Equatorial Africa. Now, I think all of this is relevant. I think the fact that the French were in this region of sub-Saharan Africa over the course of 400 years has a legacy that we see in contemporary development politics, not just gender and development politics, but the whole development industry, if you like, in sub-Saharan Africa is affected by this colonial legacy, and I will talk a little bit more about that subsequently. So there's an early map of the French presence. It was actually Louis XIV, the Sun King, who bought part of Senegal from the African kings who controlled the land on the western seaboard, the Atlantic seaboard, and from there on, the French incursion into Africa was pretty relentless. So why study this field? I shall just briefly outline what I see to be the problem, the issue, or even, as I mentioned in my book, the crisis in sub-Saharan French-speaking Africa. I will just go through the main kinds of solution that has been thrown at the problem of underdevelopment, poverty, famine, etc. in this area, and say a word about why I think those solutions or responses have not been sustainable, or have not worked, or have not generated the results that were expected. It's not just what I think, I'm actually drawing on a huge body of literature, critical literature, on the last 50 years of development policy in Africa. And then I want to get on to looking at what ideas we are exploring at the moment, where we think we might be able to come up with responses that are more sustainable and more appropriate to the problems that we've been identifying in that area. And I hope I'm going to leave enough time to have a discussion with everybody and to get some ideas from you as to where we in gender and development studies might be learning from other areas of sustainable or sustainability, sustainable studies. So, okay, why this research? The research addresses development issues, and there is a common assumption about development that holds that although countries are very poor, and indeed the countries that I look at in sub-Saharan Africa are very poor by anybody's calculation, things are generally getting better. That's a kind of common assumption. It's perhaps a legacy of the trickle-down theory. For the economists among you, you'll be familiar with trickle-down, that held that if the top layers of society get rich, then eventually that wealth will trickle down, and ultimately poverty will disappear at the bottom. This theory was shown to be rather wide of the mark in the 1980s, and it doesn't have that much currency anymore, but you still come across it occasionally. But the evidence has shown that far from that rich layer of society actually generating more wealth at the bottom, what we've seen over the last 50 years is a substantial growth in the distance between those who are very rich and those who are very poor. For instance, in 1960, for instance, the top 20% of the world's population was 30 times richer than the bottom, and then by the year 2000, you'll find that the top 20% is 80 times richer than the bottom 20%. And I quote Emmanuel Wallerstein here in Africa, the Politics of Independence and Unity, which he published in 2005, where he says, all statistics point to Africa as not only the poorest continent, but relative to the rest of the world, much poorer than it was 50 years ago. And in many years, and in many areas in absolute terms as well. And that's where Francophone Africa comes in, because of course in Francophone Africa, that situation is palpable, that over the last 50 years, that part of the world has actually become very much poorer. So that explains why I'm looking at this region. All the statistics, all the evidence shows that the development policy hasn't actually brought this region out of poverty. So why about women? Well, unfortunately, not only is this region the poorest in Africa, but once you put gender into the equation, you come up with the world's most disadvantaged population by all the global indicators. And consequently, we're looking at a situation, and this is why I describe the situation as being critical. If that wasn't bad enough, this is getting very gloomy, I know, but unfortunately, since the global recession began in late 2007, 2008, it's been noted that 85% of women in this part of the world, in sub-Saharan Africa, have seen their standard of living drop. So this is a big problem, and it's a problem that has not gone away, and it's a problem that might actually get worse. So this is why we are concentrating our efforts particularly on looking at this. Now, there have been lots of responses over the years to this issue. It's not as if people have just been sitting back and doing nothing. There's been a very substantial financial response to underdevelopment or developing world issues in Africa. What you have on the screen here is an indication of how much ODA, or official development assistance, is spent on gender. And as you can see, the £25 billion goes into the issues specifically surrounding men as opposed to women, or women as opposed to men in the developing world. And if you look at the amount of effort that's put into addressing specifically gender issues, and specifically that whole issue of women being significantly more disadvantaged than men in the poorest regions of the world, you can see that people are not ignoring this issue, that gender is a significant factor in the design of projects and programs being implemented in sub-Saharan Africa and in Africa, generally. You can't read this, but I just put this up as an example of even in the area where the international community is least interested in funding projects and programs, and that's to say in the area of women's economic empowerment. Even in this area, the average annual budget will be between 4 and 5 billion US dollars. So we're talking a substantial financial response. I mean, you might come back to me and say, well, how much money is enough money for this kind of crisis, this kind of situation? But what I'm just trying to illustrate here is that, a substantial amount of overseas development assistance is being ploughed into gender and development projects and into this particular area. And this is just to illustrate how much money is going into each individual country in these rather disadvantaged areas. This is Senegal, as I mentioned before, the first of the French colonies in French West Africa. It receives annually in the order of 23 million US dollars for social projects, most of which, 60% of which, have a gender dimension. You can add to that another 30 million that are specifically for educational projects, and most education projects have a very explicit gender dimension. And that is ODA, that's to say this is overseas development assistance that comes from the EU or comes from individual member states. We organise our ODA, UK ODA, through the OECD. So we are a member of a club called the Development Assistance Club in the OECD, and we also contribute to this through the European Union, of course. And so we contribute to 50% of the government's efforts, the Senegalese government's efforts in the field of gender and equality and what they call now equity. So that's just a very quick overview of the financial response from the international community, and I hope I've illustrated that, as I say, I can't say how much is enough, but there is a considerable amount of money being dispersed into this particular area. There have been other responses that have been equally highly developed within the international community, and I'm just going to look at 3 other areas of response to the crisis: legal responses, political responses, and most latterly the structural responses. By legal responses, I mean that initially the international community responded to what they identified as the gender and development issue in the poorer parts of the world at that time, in South Asia, in Africa, etc., by stating initially through the UN Charter of 1945, that it was committed to achieving equality between men and women. And the UN set up an agency, well, quite a few agencies actually, to then go on and design instruments to bring about gender and equality in countries throughout the world. And these instruments initially took the form of international conventions. And what happened was that the member states, when they were all meeting together in New York or Geneva, and were asked by the UN General Assembly to sign up to a new convention promoting some aspect of gender equality, such as the consent to marriage, which was put to the UN General Assembly in the early 60s, and just about everybody signed up to. What happened was people were signing up to these conventions in the international summits, and then even ratifying those conventions back home in their national parliaments. But unfortunately, that's as far as things were going. And then they hit a political, cultural, whatever it was, block when they got back to the member states. And so the UN took action and said, okay, if people are not going to be implementing all these individual conventions, we'll put everything together into one big convention. And this produced CEDAW, and I suppose some of you will have heard of that. It's the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, which was adopted in the UN in 1979 and came into force in 1981, and nearly every member state of the United Nations system is signatory to this, and the vast majority have ratified it. But still, there is a problem with implementing the agreements, the targets, the objectives that are contained within this convention. So, realizing that a legal conventional response was not really going to have much impact on the ground in countries such as Mali, Niger, etc., where implementation was almost non-existent, the international community, in its wisdom, decided to take a more political approach to this, and it launched a whole movement known as the World's Women's Summit in 1975. The first one was in Mexico City, and Mexico City was all about identifying the scale of economic disadvantage in the world suffered specifically by women. So it was, if you like, establishing the gender profile of economic disadvantage globally. There were 4 women's summits altogether. The second one was held in Copenhagen, and nobody really took much notice of that. The third one was held in Nairobi, in East Africa, and Nairobi was a very significant point in the political history of the gender and development movement, if you like, because they really mapped out the whole panoply of issues that needed to be addressed before a country could hope to aspire to achieving equality, socioeconomic equality between men and women. And they came up with a raft of 183 targets to be met by 1995, so within 10 years. And after 10 years, those targets were reviewed at the last of the World's Women's Summits, which was held in Beijing in 1995. And the analysis of progress over the last 10 years was very disappointing at Beijing. So they decided it wasn't really worth having all these objectives, all these targets. So they decided to have just a few very measurable, achievable targets to aim for by the year 2000 and beyond. So the political response, unfortunately, when it was reviewed in the year 2000, found that far from having removed those political or cultural obstacles I referred to before that were standing in the way of the conventions being implemented in the member states, it appeared that the political resistance to gender equity targets had actually grown over the previous 5 years. There was a very strong reaction from women's groups who attended the Beijing +5 summit, as it was called, in New York in the year 2000, who noted that key targets that had been agreed at the Beijing summit in 1995 had now disappeared from the international agenda. It looked as if the whole review and the whole conference around reviewing the world's women's summits was going to collapse. And so Kofi Annan had to, who was the Secretary General of the UN at the time, had to intervene in the conference and warn delegates that the objectives that had been agreed at Beijing in 1995 were not up for negotiation at the 2000 conference. However, in a sense, although the targets that had been agreed previously were reinstated into the Beijing +5 document, at the end of the day, that whole impetus towards getting more refined targets, more achievable targets, agreed across the international community was rather overtaken by events, because later in 2000 the global community involved in development assistance redefined its development agenda for the 21st century in a summit called the Millennium Development Summit. And the Development Summit gave rise to 8 what are called the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, the MDGs that I mentioned here. And there are now only 8, and there is one target for gender equality, and that has almost been reduced to access to education, although an outcry following that meant that a few more targets were put in. But essentially, instead of seeing a build-up of engagement, if you like, behind the gender inequality movement during that period of the World Women's Summits between 1975 and the year 2000 with the Beijing +5 summit, you actually see the gains having been lost during that period. And within the Millennium Development Goal 3, which is the Millennium Development Goal that defines the international community's position on gender equality for the first 15 years at least of the 21st century, you will see a definition of gender equality that is very weak compared with the definitions that were offered at Nairobi in 1985 and in Beijing in 1995. So, yeah.
I don't know the area of West Africa you coloured yellow, but is it a cultural convention or a religious convention that women cannot own property, run a business, sign a contract?
Right. That's a very good point, which I will be coming on to that actually in a minute. I will get there, so I'll remember your question at that point. But there are of course, within the countries what we call droit coutumier, okay, which is traditional law, and there is the international agreements and so on. Unfortunately, the international agreements and these development goals and so on don't have in themselves legal weight. They have to be ratified within the parliaments and the legal systems, indeed, of the member states who are party to the conventions, as you're probably familiar. What then happens in the country is a problem. And I was speaking actually with the head of the Constitutional Council, who's the chief lawyer, if you like, in Gabon about this. And she said to me that they go off to these conferences and they sign up and they try and apply them back in Gabon. But she says, I can give a ruling here as head of the Constitutional Council in Libreville, and I know that 2 miles down the road, some local judge is going to take no notice of what I am saying. So yeah, that is an issue, and that's exactly the kind of issue that I'm going to come back to, you know, at the end when we look at kind of new ideas and better ideas for. So what research is looking at the moment is the practice of development, which is what I've been running through here. What are the results on the ground? And we also look at the discourse of development, and it's in that area that we're looking to see whether there are better ideas, better ways that we could be tackling some of these issues in the future. I would summarize my ideas for how we could move research forward in this area in terms of KT, which of course in universities we're all very familiar with this, knowledge transfer, and plus knowledge creation. But I think that as well as that, you need to be looking at a new architecture within which policy can be formulated, both in the locality and, most importantly, centrally in the international institutions. And as far as gender and development is concerned, the major institutions are located in New York. And I will be talking about trying to culturally embed as well gender and development policy. So as far as knowledge transfer is concerned, I would argue that there is an enormous amount of knowledge out there, particularly in the West Africa region, but not solely in the West Africa region, that we can use usefully in reassessing where we're going to go from here forward in gender and development policy. I think one important thing is to re-engage with what I call the Colonial Archive. That's to say, there's been a colonial history of Africa written that still affects the way that we think about development in this area. For instance, I think it's fair to say that there is a common assumption that African women are coming out of centuries of disadvantage, of subjugation to male domination. That is the general presentation of the African woman's lot that one gets from reading African history up to the end of the colonial period, for instance, which was of course written for the most part by people who were not indigenous to that area, and indeed weren't of the same gender as those people that they were writing on. So we've seen that that particular configuration of gender in colonial and pre-colonial times has come under attack. It came under attack in the 60s from African historians such as Sheikh Anta Diop. Are there any historians here who might be familiar with Diop, who really redefined the whole geography of African history, bringing in Egypt, rediscovering written histories, indigenous written histories of Africa. Since that, we've had Basil Davidson and various eminent historians who have been trying to rewrite that colonial history of Africa. But there are some elements that live on in our perception of the plight, if you like, of the African woman. And well, I've done quite a bit of research actually around this over the last 10 years that I was doing field work, and I've discovered that far from being subjugated, the reality is that gender politics in pre-colonial Africa were very varied. There are areas in Gabon around the equator where you can find quite unequal societies where women were quite disadvantaged, and you can find other areas, the Hausa lands, for instance, in modern Nigeria, where the empires were run by women. There's the famous case of Princess Amina of the Hausa, who was the first princess of a whole dynasty of 17 female rulers of modern-day Nigeria. And that history, interestingly, became mythologized and has only recently been rediscovered as authentic history, as opposed to myth. So you see that there is actually quite a lot of knowledge there that we need to recast the historical and cultural context in which we are working. And not only do we have the historical archive to contend with, we also have the actual practical legacy of French colonial rule in the area from 1895 in French West Africa and from 1910 in French Equatorial Africa, where the French introduced, for instance, land registration laws in 1906 that overruled le droit coutumier, or traditional law. And so women who had traditionally owned land for millennia in that part of the world lost the land because they couldn't register the land in their name. They couldn't do that because of the introduction of the French Civil Code, the Civil Code of 1802, the Napoleonic Code, whereby a woman's status is that of a minor. So the combination of the land registration laws and not being able to own land as a minor dispossessed women of their inheritance. And on top of that, the introduction of a colonial economy further took land away from subsistence farming, and women were the subsistence farmers just as men were. And the men were taken off into the colonial economy, in the mines, in the plantations, and also by 1914 into the French army. And you see a withering of the local economy in that first 30, 40 years of the 20th century. And all that still plays out in the position that women hold in this area. The lands that they haven't regained, the jobs that they didn't regain. Just briefly, that's some of the ways in which we can re-engage with the Colonial Archive and get knowledge that is relevant to implementing policy in this part of the world. Also, there's an awful lot of locally produced research which is very interesting and never gets out of the region. So unless you actually can be bothered to go off to Libreville or Dakar or Bamako or whatever and go and meet with local academics who are very, very generous and will give you copies of their books, unpublished books and so on, one would never get access to this. So that is a rich seam of information that is yet to be exploited. And lastly, I'd just like to say a couple of words about new sources of information. Now, this is where my research departs from the norm, in the sense that I'm a social scientist, and normally I would not use literature to explore the policy field that I'm writing about. But in this particular case, I have found that feminist social fiction has been illuminating in explaining why gender and development policy over the last 50 years has been such a lamentable failure in Francophone West Africa. Mariam Abba, for instance, explores the impact of education on local, on Senegalese women, as does Mam Yunus Dieng, which is who's an author whom you wouldn't have heard of, I think, if you hadn't visited this country. And she is an excellent writer who has looked at the introduction of primary school education in rural Senegal and the devastating impact that that can have on a local community. Now, this is very important because an enormous amount of the effort at the moment is going into achieving 100% access to primary education. And the point being made here in this literature is that that's all well and good, but unless you design a curriculum that's adapted to the local community, and unless you deliver that curriculum through structures that likewise are amenable with the local community, you can have very seriously, very problematic results. And these are very graphically described in Mam Yunus Dieng's work. And Justine Minter, I'm just mention her because she engages with the Western medical services, infant and maternal health services that have been introduced into sub-Saharan Africa, and she critiques these and demonstrates how local maternal and infant health care is superior in some cases to these imported versions. So the point that they're all making, and the point that I would make just to conclude, is to say that one size does not fit all, that education as it is delivered in Western schools does not fit into a rural Senegalese context without some kind of cultural mediation. And I would also say that that ability to mediate that knowledge that we have about these areas of development, education, maternal health, etc., that knowledge is there. And so the challenge, as I see it, is creating what I call this architecture that can accommodate these two areas of knowledge and create a more culturally embedded approach to gender and development policy. And with that, I will stop talking, having rushed, I fear, through rather a large study in globalizing the post-colony. But anyway, thank you very much for your attention. Sorry, I overran. I've got
That was wonderful, very interesting presentation. I think that there are so many things that are being left because there's so much to cover. But I wonder if you want to make some questions and to start the discussion, Alex?
So I don't know, it's related to Woody's question around the role of government or some of the large organisations in the country, religious organisations, businesses. I'm just wondering, because in sub-Saharan Africa, actually the percentage of women in government is about a quarter, whereas in Europe it's about 10% elected. And the African Union recently said there will be more heads of state, whether you believe it or not, proportionally in Africa that are female than anywhere else. But then that doesn't seem to get very far down into society. So what is the actual barrier for gender equality? Because it seems to be actually better than the majority of Europe, but certainly being elected to Parliament, it's still not anywhere near 50%. But there must be some barrier at some level. And what is there?
There's so many good points in what you're saying. In Francophone Africa, the percentage would be a little less. The highest percentage is in Mauritania, at 22%. We'll have to wait and see what happens in Senegal, because of course we've had a change of regime over the last few weeks. But when I've discussed this in Dakar or in Libreville, people will be quick to point out to me that the tradition of women being involved in politics in Africa, in informal politics, they believe is much more developed than the European model. So they wouldn't see any contradiction there, if you like. But what I have noted in Francophone Africa particularly is that the post-colonial elite, as we call them, those who have held the reins of power since 1960, since the French left, were a body of men who had been educated and trained by France. Léopold Sédar Senghor, the first president of Senegal, is the perfect example of that. Member of the Académie Française, completely integrated into the French establishment. So that whole culture, political culture that came from France and Europe, has been continued through this political elite. Very recently, since 1990, things have changed, not least because at the Franco-African Summit in 1990, François Mitterrand put down certain conditions. It was the aid conditionality that happened in Anglophone Africa as well, and said that the institutions of the state had to develop more democratically, and that would include a better representation for women. But what we actually saw in Francophone Africa in the 1990s was a drop in the representation of women, because the governments who had come in Cameroon, in Senegal, in Gabon, etc., in 1960 had put in a quota for women. In Senegal, for instance, it was 25% of all parliamentary seats should be held by women. I mean, they never got anywhere near it, but nevertheless, it was there, and it was part of the Socialist Party rhetoric. Of course, women had been very active in the anti-colonial movement and in the independence movement as well, so it was a bit of a sop to that. But in actual fact, it hasn't translated very clearly into practice. The exception, of course, is Rwanda, where the majority of parliamentarians are women, but that's a completely different political case with a very different history, of course, as we all know. But does that go any way to answering the question?
Rosie?
I was very interested in what you were talking about targets, and then there being, lots of targets set, and then over time the diminishing number of targets. And it's quite interesting parallel. Well, I was thinking about from another aspect of sustainability of the large emissions targets that we're faced with at the moment that are being set on sort of grand scale and then trying to be implemented. And I was just wondering what you thought about whether these targets had any use. I mean, were they a good thing to have? And also issues around was one of the difficulties around the targets were being set by one system, sort of international system, whereas actually they needed to be implemented on a completely, like they weren't really coming from the internal,
I see exactly what
to actually achieve them.
Yes.
And I don't know whether there's ideas about ways that targets could be perhaps more well set up. But
yes. I would fear that the implementation of those targets would face similar obstacles to those that I have enumerated here. I fear that the whole way of formulating public policy is is flawed, and that is something I think that we can learn, well, sustainability perhaps can learn from all areas of development policy, that if you haven't got a conversation going between those who are going to implement the policy and those who are formulating the policy, then things can break down. And also, I don't know very much about environmental sustainability in francophone Africa, but I would imagine that the scale of the issue is completely different in francophone West Africa. As Beatriz mentioned, I'm looking at art forms at the moment. And there's one art form that's been going for a very long time in West Africa, Anglophone and Francophone, which involves recycling Coca-Cola cans, for instance, into beautiful, great big cloth. There's one in the British Museum by Brian El Anatsui, made entirely from recycled Sprite cans and Coke cans and things like that. So there's a whole movement of artists that for decades have been recycling things that they find around them. There's another movement that uses entirely found objects. It's objet trouvé, a mouvement objet trouvé, and you can only use objects that you find around you in order to create your art. So I suspect that there is a different relationship with objects that have served their first function and then, may serve a second function. And anybody who's spent any time in sub-Saharan Africa anyway will have seen enormous amounts of recycling going on as a matter of course. If you have milk delivered in a plastic bidon thing, then it's used for all sorts of purposes subsequently. People don't throw things away. So I'm not quite sure how you could come up with a policy that would suit Germany and Gabon, really. I think that would be quite a challenge.
I apologize that I don't know this part of the world well, but I'm very concerned with these same issues in parts of Asia, including Central Asia, where there are huge inequalities, huge structural inequalities, whatever the notional policies are.
Yeah.
And across vast areas of the poor world, there are two issues that are certainly affecting the position of women in these societies. One is urbanization, that more and more people are desperately moving into poorer and poorer outskirts of the cities. So traditional extended family links and the status of the grandmother. So often, not all women in an extended family have status, but there's often one or two, like those Hausa princesses you talked about. These societies can tolerate a few high-status women, just not very many. And that's very typical of many Asian societies. But it breaks down with urbanization. They lose that family or clan status. And the other problem, and this is very often driven by reckless government policies or very short-term commercial initiatives, is degradation of the agricultural land. So the societies that really value cattle, sheep, these sort of things, the land just isn't as productive as it used to be. And that's very disruptive to people's sense of hope in the future, hope in themselves. Have you observed in French-speaking Africa?
Well, exactly the same phenomenon. The economic, the loss of land to mining, the loss of land to the plantations, the most fertile arable land taken over by the colonial economy, and subsequently in the export cash crop economy, undermining subsistence farming, and creating a new division of labour, sending men off into the cash economy and into the urban areas, and leaving women without a traditional agricultural labour force. I think the issue around status is different, and I think this is where the African history is quite interesting in finding the diversity of status in fairly kind of what look like small regions, sub-regions of Africa. You'll find quite a significant variation. I don't know about Asia, but I do know that Asia has been, of course, the subject of Amartya Sen, among others, research into the 100+ million missing women. That these missing women who have lost their lives as babies or even before they were born are from South Asia and China. So clearly there is a different status issue around that, the status of male babies and the status of female babies, that doesn't carry over in that form into the African context.
The Indian example has a very rich mythological dimension. Mother Earth, Mother India, is very female, and the way the Ashanti in Ghana, women have the land. The land is basically female because, and that's an attribute of agriculture.
Well, it was one of the matrilineages,
yeah.
Yes.
But that's completely disrupted with degradation of traditional farming, and with women having to seek work in societies where they're really looked down on. And if that's a problem in the more affluent China and India, where at least there are some jobs, in Central Asia where there are no jobs, where you have completely mad, corrupt dictators who totally impoverish these countries. And I believe similar things happened maybe in the Central African Republic, that women suffer most from this upheaval.
Yes, well, there's been a lot of evidence since 2008 and the downturn of who is bearing the brunt of this in the developing world.
Mina, would you like to?
Yeah, I actually would like to follow up on some of the things you mentioned and linking up with your identification of areas of future research and tapping on local knowledge, or it used to be called Indigenous technical knowledge, MTK.
Yes.
But you're absolutely right. Women, I've actually worked in Southern Africa, and a bit different from francophone Africa.
Yeah.
But the one thing that's very similar is that women have a very deep and close relationship with the land, and while men tend the cattle, women actually cultivate the fields. And going back to knowledge, local knowledge, the women had incredible knowledge on soil conservation, for example. And this was lost during the colonial period with an imposition of colonial techniques to manage soil erosion. And I actually did some work on looking at how this knowledge was transported from one colony to another. So in other words, there was a prescription of if land is a certain slope, there needs to be terraced.
Yeah.
And this was done in India, in Australia, in the West Indies, irrespective of local conditions.
Yes.
And that's when you actually got the loss of the local knowledge. And I think that it would be really good to focus on trying to dig up this knowledge.
Yes.
And I used oral history, which was really effective in Southern Africa, in actually documenting local knowledge about soil conservation and generally, how to tackle environmental degradation.
That's fascinating. There was quite a lot of activity in the middle of the last century in French West Africa. There were several, there was a woman historian, a political scientist, an anthropologist, and they went out and tried to capture some of that knowledge. But almost nothing of that type has taken place in the post-colonial era in French scholarship anyway. So I'm sure that there's quite a lot of American stuff. Nyara Sudakaza has done very interesting research kind of similar to yours in West Africa, in Côte d'Ivoire, Mali, around economic practices. But that, yes, the whole issue of retelling the history is still very much in its infancy.
Yeah, also if I might just pick up on Alet's point on the point of representation of women, at certain levels in government. I mean, what happened in Southern Africa, as I assume happened in many other parts of Africa, is that during the colonial period, when minerals were discovered and you had mining, the workforce, men were taken away from the land and taken to work in the mines. Yes. And the irony of that situation is that you get in post-colonial elite Africa a very high percentage of very highly educated women and a lot of men who continued the tradition of working in mines. It was something that was very much linked to a kind almost like a rite of passage for every man in Lesotho. It was really important. Men who are now professors still started their career by spending a year working in the mines in South Africa, because that was then they were men, they were initiated and they became men. So this is also reflected in the political system. But I think there in rural Africa, as in Cambridge, I mean, you can't change any of those targets until you provide childcare, until you address some of the very, very basic issues which prevent women's full participation in the whole global economy.
Or you change the global economy so that it doesn't demand 100% attention 100% of the time.
Yes.
But I think that what Claire was telling also is that idea that one size doesn't fit all. So how can we go and dig up, recover, integrate those local knowledge and local traditions and local ways of doing, rather than saying, here we say, well, the best way for women is so and so and so, or the best way for men are, I don't know, it is that necessity of going and talking and recovering what is happening there and empowering people there. That's something that is what I've got from your talk today. And it's the same with sustainability. We cannot propose some targets that are only for European countries, but how those targets can be relevant or not for other countries. So that's very interesting. I don't know if there is more questions or.
No. We have informal questions, options.
Okay, that would be good. So, well, thank you, Claire, very much.
No,
that was
thank
wonderful.
you very much.
And I would like to leave you with our new, beautiful, sustainable produce leaflets. So,
and do you help yourself to
want to take some of them. So, thank you, Claire, very much.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.